Hello, my name is Joe. I want to talk to you tonight about American politics. I understand if that sentence made you tense up a little. I understand if upon hearing those two words together, American politics, something in your body did a small, involuntary thing. A slight tightening behind the sternum, maybe, or a faint sensation in the jaw. I notice these things in myself sometimes, and I want to tell you right at the beginning, before we go any further, I am going to try very hard not to do that to you. I am going to try to talk about American politics the way you would talk about a very complicated and occasionally frightening piece of music, with respect for what it is, attention to its structure, and a genuine belief that understanding it, even a little better, is worth the effort. I am a choral music teacher at a middle school in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I am not a political scientist. I'm not a pundit, which is a word that I find slightly uncomfortable in the way that some words are uncomfortable, not because they're wrong, but because they describe something that seems to require more certainty than I personally possess. A pundit is someone who tells you what things mean. I'm more comfortable telling you what things are. What they might mean is something we can think about together, slowly, without anyone raising their voice. There is a cup of tea on the table next to me, chamomile. It is from the same box I mentioned previously. I buy it in bulk because I find the individual tea bags comforting to handle. They are small and papery, and they smell like something that has decided to be helpful. Outside, it is a dark evening in a way that feels specifically American, the particular darkness of a town where most people have gone inside, where the streetlights are humming their one note, where someone's flag is moving slightly in a wind you can't hear through the window. Flags move more at night, I think, or perhaps I only notice them more. I want to start with the beginning. Or rather, a beginning. There are several ways to begin the story of American politics, and each beginning implies a different story, which I think is itself a political observation, though I'll try not to lean on it too hard. One beginning is 1776, the Declaration of Independence. 56 men in Philadelphia in July, in what must have been tremendous heat. Philadelphia in July is not comfortable, agreeing to sign a document that said, essentially, we believe certain things to be true, and we are willing to stake everything on that belief. The document is beautiful. I have read it many times. It begins with a sentence that is, I think, one of the finest sentences in the English language, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. That phrase, dissolve the political bands, has the quality of something said quietly, but with great firmness. Like a resignation letter written by someone who has been patient for a very long time. The truths they held to be self-evident were not universally applied at the time of their writing. I don't want to pass over this. The men who wrote that all men are created equal and other men. This is a fact that sits in the middle of American history the way a large stone sits in the middle of a road. You can try to go around it, but it is always there, and it changes the route. I'm not going to pretend the stone isn't there, but I also don't want to spend our entire evening staring at the stone, because I think there is value in also looking at what the people who came after, across a long and painful and ongoing time, have done with those words, have stretched them, have argued that the words meant more than the writers intended, have said, you wrote this, and we are going to hold you to it. That argument, the argument about what those words obligate us to, is, in some sense, the argument that American politics has been having ever since. Another beginning is 1787, the Constitutional Convention, the same city, somewhat cooler weather, a much longer project. 55 delegates spent 4 months in Philadelphia writing a document that was supposed to solve the problems of the first one, the Articles of Confederation, which had been governing the country since independence, and which had turned out to be not quite sufficient. The Articles had given too little power to the national government. States were acting like independent countries. There was no national currency, no way to enforce agreements between states, no executive to carry out laws. It was, in the words of one delegate, and I'm paraphrasing here, a system that worked on the assumption that everyone would cooperate voluntarily, which is a lovely assumption, and also an optimistic one. So they wrote the Constitution. And the Constitution has 3 articles for the 3 branches of government, legislative, executive, judicial, and it has a preamble, which is the part most people know, and which is also, I think, very beautiful. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. That phrase, a more perfect union, has always struck me as honest in a way that political documents aren't always honest. It doesn't say a perfect union, it says a more perfect one. It acknowledges that perfection is a direction, not a destination. You are always traveling toward it, you don't arrive, but you keep going. I find this comforting on good days. Here is a small thing I find interesting. The word democracy does not appear in the Constitution, not once. The document describes a republic, a system of representative government, but it does not use the word democracy. The founders were, in fact, somewhat wary of democracy in its pure form, which they associated with mob rule, with the volatility of popular passion, with the risk that a majority might simply overwhelm the rights of a minority. They designed the Constitution with this wariness in mind. The Senate gives equal representation to large and small states. The Electoral College was meant to filter popular choice. The Supreme Court is appointed, not elected. Senators were not directly elected by the public until 1913. The system was designed to slow things down, to create friction, to make it harder for any one person or party or passion to move too fast.
So this slowing mechanism is a feature or a flaw, is a debate that continues.
I find that most things about the Constitution are debates that continue. The document was designed to be debated. It was designed to be a framework for arguing about what it means. This is either its great genius or its great frustration, depending on the day. I took a civics class in 1994. My teacher was a man named Mr. Kowalski, who had been teaching civics at the same school for 22 years, and who carried himself with the particular patience of someone who has explained the 3 branches of government to 8th graders many hundreds of times, and has decided at some point that the repetition itself has a kind of dignity. He wore the same 2 ties on alternating days, one blue, one burgundy, and he ate lunch at his desk every day, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper that he opened slowly, as if the wax paper were a small curtain being drawn back on something worth seeing. Mr. Kowalski believed, with what I now recognize as a quiet and deliberate conviction, that understanding how government works was the most practical skill a person could have. More practical than algebra, he said once, though I don't think he meant this as a slight to algebra. He meant that knowing how a bill becomes a law, knowing how your representative is chosen, knowing the difference between a primary and a general election, these were tools. And tools, he said, are only useful to the person who picks them up. He said this while eating his sandwich, looking at us with an expression that was not stern exactly, but was serious in a way I appreciated even then, when I was 13 and not yet sure what I thought about most things. I think about Mr. Kowalski a lot when I think about American politics. I think about the fact that he showed up every day for 22 years to explain the same structures to children who were mostly preoccupied with other things. I think about all the people who have shown up to do that, in classrooms across the country, patient, careful, trying to give young people the tools they might someday pick up. I think it is one of the more important jobs there is, and I think it is one of the jobs that receives the least recognition for its importance, which is true of many important jobs, and which is something I think about more than I probably let on. Let me tell you about the branches of government, because I think it is worth spending a few minutes on the structure before we get to the arguments. The structure is the thing that makes the arguments possible, or at least makes them survivable. Without the structure, an argument becomes something else, something less orderly. The legislative branch is Congress. Congress has 2 chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate has 100 members, 2 from each state, regardless of population. Wyoming and California each have 2 senators. Wyoming has a population of about 500,000. California has a population of nearly 40 million. They have the same number of senators. This is either a profound commitment to the equality of states as political units, or an arrangement that gives disproportionate power to smaller, less populous states, depending on your perspective. Both of these perspectives are held sincerely by people who have thought about it carefully. I will not tell you which perspective is correct. I don't think that's my place tonight. I will say only that the arrangement was the result of a significant compromise at the Constitutional Convention, the Connecticut Compromise, and that without it, the smaller states would not have ratified the Constitution, and without ratification, there would have been no Constitution. Compromise produced the document. The document then proceeded to make compromise somewhat harder, which is one of the more interesting ironies of the whole enterprise. The House of Representatives has 435 members, and the number from each state is based on population, which is why California has 52 representatives and Wyoming has 1. The total number of 435 has been fixed since 1929 by law, which means it hasn't changed even as the population has grown substantially. In 1910, there was roughly 1 representative per 212,000 people. Now there is roughly 1 per 760,000. Whether this matters, how it matters, what should be done about it, these are questions that people discuss with varying levels of heat. I mention it not to start a fire, but simply because I think it is useful to know the dimensions of a room before you try to move through it. The executive branch is the president and the vice president and the cabinet and a large number of departments and agencies that carry out the laws passed by Congress. The president is elected every 4 years, and no one can be elected more than twice. This limit, the 2-term limit, was not in the original Constitution. It became a norm because George Washington voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms, and the norm held more or less until 1940, when Franklin Roosevelt was elected to a 3rd term and then a 4th. After his death, the 22nd Amendment was ratified in 1951, making the limit law rather than custom. I find this interesting, the way a habit, practiced long enough, can become a norm, and a norm, broken once, can become a law. The system learns from itself, slowly, and sometimes only after the fact, but it learns. The judicial branch is the Supreme Court, and the federal court system below it. The Supreme Court has 9 justices, a number that is not specified in the Constitution. It has changed several times over history, ranging from 6 to 10 before settling at 9 in 1869. The justices are nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate, and they serve for life, or until they choose to retire, or until they are impeached, which has never happened. Life tenure is designed to make the justices independent of political pressure. They don't have to worry about our re-election because there is no re-election. They can follow the law, in theory, wherever it leads, without worrying about what the public or the President thinks. Whether this insulation from political pressure produces decisions that are genuinely non-political is, again, a question people argue about. I will say only that the court is a human institution, and human institutions are shaped by the humans who run them, and humans bring to their work their experiences and their beliefs and their reasoning, and it would be strange if a court composed of 9 humans produced results that were entirely independent of those things. The justices would probably disagree with this characterization. This is also a human thing, to believe that one's judgments are more objective than they are. I do this. We probably all do this. I try to catch myself when I do it, with limited success. I want to pause and mention something called federalism, because I think it is one of the more underappreciated features of the American system, and also one of the more confusing ones. Federalism is the division of power between the national government and the state governments. The Constitution gives certain powers to the federal government, regulating interstate commerce, conducting foreign policy, maintaining the military, and reserves other powers to the states. States can set their own laws on many things: education, most criminal law, marriage law until the Supreme Court ruled otherwise, voting rules, speed limits. This is why you can do certain things in one state that you cannot do in another. It is why a law passed in Michigan might look nothing like a law passed in Texas, or Vermont or Oregon. The country is one country, but it is also 50 experiments, running simultaneously with different rules, and sometimes the experiments produce useful information, and sometimes they produce a great deal of confusion, and sometimes both at once. I want to tell you about Gerald Pavola. He was a man who lived in my town for most of his life, and he ran for city council about 12 years ago, and he lost by a fairly significant margin. I want to tell you about Gerald, because I think Gerald is, in some ways, the story of American politics that I find most meaningful, even though he never held office, and even though his name will not appear in any history book, and even though the city council race he lost was for a small city in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, in an election that was covered by one newspaper and attended, in terms of voter turnout, by approximately 19% of eligible voters in the district. Gerald worked at a hardware store. He'd worked there for many years. He was the kind of person who knew where everything was, not just in the store, but in general, who owned which lot when the road had last been repaved, which pipes in the older neighborhoods were the ones most likely to cause trouble in a cold winter. He knew these things because he paid attention over a long time, and because people told him things when they came in for their supplies, and because he listened. Gerald was a very good listener. He had the quality of listening that makes you feel, when he is doing it, that what you are saying is worth hearing. Gerald decided to run for city council because the council had recently voted to close a community center in his neighborhood. A small building, nothing elaborate, with a gymnasium and a meeting room and a kitchen that the neighborhood had used for 30 years for potlucks and community meetings, and a very popular Saturday morning program for elderly residents that Gerald had helped organize. The council said the building was too expensive to maintain. Gerald said the building was worth maintaining. He went to council meetings and said this. He wrote letters to the local paper and said this. And then he decided to run for council because he felt that the way to change what the council decided was to be on the council, which is a very reasonable thing to think. He knocked on doors. He made phone calls. He stood outside the grocery store on Saturday mornings, not quite blocking the entrance, talking to people who were willing to stop. I stopped once on my way in to buy rice, and Gerald told me about the community center and about his plans for zoning and about a proposal he had for how the city could better maintain the roads without raising taxes significantly by adjusting the repaving schedule to be more strategic. It was a reasonable proposal. It was the kind of proposal you make when you've been paying attention to the roads for 20 years, and you have ideas that are small and specific and probably workable. Gerald lost. He got 37% of the vote in a two-person race. His opponent, who had more money for yard signs and whose name appeared more often in local news because of his previous term on the Planning Commission, got 63%. Gerald accepted this outcome on election night with a kind of quiet that I found genuinely moving. He said something at a small gathering of his supporters. I wasn't there, but someone who has told me about it later. He said something along the lines of, "I believe in this process. I don't like this result. But I believe in the process, and I'll keep showing up, and maybe that's what matters." And then, as far as I know, he went back to the hardware store the next day, and he kept going to council meetings, and he kept knowing where everything was. I want to talk about political parties. The United States has had a two-party system for most of its history, which is not a requirement of the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't mention political parties at all, and several of the founders were specifically worried about them. George Washington, in his farewell address, warned against what he called the baneful effects of the spirit of party. He worried that parties would divide the country into factions that cared more about winning than about governing. He worried that loyalty to party would replace loyalty to country. He was quite clear about this. It was one of the things he felt most strongly about at the end of his life, looking back at what he had helped to build. Washington said this in 1796. By 1800, there were two established parties and a viciously contested election that went to the House of Representatives to be decided. Washington had been gone from office for 4 years. His warning had, in practical terms, not been heeded. This is perhaps the most American outcome possible. A founding father warns emphatically against something, and then the thing happens almost immediately. It is either poignant or funny, depending on the day. Usually I find it both. The two major parties today, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, are not the original two parties. The parties have changed enormously over time in ways that can be confusing when you try to draw a straight line from then to now. The Republican Party was founded in 1854, partly on the opposition to the expansion of slavery into new territories. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president. The Democratic Party, the older of the two, had a significant faction in the mid-19th century that opposed abolition. These positions have, broadly speaking, reversed over the course of a century or so through a process that was gradual and complicated, and that historians continue to analyze and argue about. I mention this not to score a point for any side. I genuinely don't want to do that tonight, but because I think it's important to understand that the parties we have now are not the parties they were. Coalitions shift. Alliances change. The labels stay the same while the contents rearrange. This is true of parties, and it is also true, in my experience, of cardboard boxes in a basement, which always seem to contain different things than you expect when you open them. One of the things people often say about American politics is that it has never been more divided. I have heard this said in my lifetime many times, and I suspect it was said in every previous lifetime as well, because division is a recurring feature of democratic politics rather than a new development. The Civil War was a division. The period of Reconstruction was a division. The fights over labor rights in the early 20th century were divisions that sometimes turned violent. The MC Carthy era was a division. The 1960s, civil rights, Vietnam, the assassinations, were a division that many people who lived through them describe as a time when they genuinely were not sure the country would hold together. This is not to say that division doesn't matter, or that things aren't genuinely difficult right now, or that every era of difficulty is equivalent to every other. Context matters. Specifics matter. The particular texture of conflict at a particular moment in time matters. I don't want to flatten history into a comfortable narrative where everything always turned out fine and therefore everything will always turn out fine. History does not promise outcomes. It only provides precedents, and precedents can be read in multiple directions. What I do want to say is that the country has, repeatedly in the past, been a place where people with genuinely different visions of what it should be have had to share a system and work within it together, and that this has been hard and painful and has not always produced justice, often has not produced justice, and has also, at certain moments, produced something that, on balance, moved in a better direction. The arc of the moral universe, the Reverend said, is long, and it bends toward justice. He was an optimist and a realist in the same sentence. I try to be both. It is not always easy to be both. I want to mention something called the First Amendment because I think it is one of the most important and most misunderstood things in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition the government. It is one sentence, very long, and it applies specifically to the government, meaning the government cannot punish you for your speech, your religion, your assembly, your journalism. It does not protect you from the consequences of speech in other contexts. Your employer can fire you for things you say. A private company can remove your content from its platform. Other people can disagree with you and say so, loudly. The First Amendment does not guarantee an audience. It does not guarantee respect. It does not guarantee that your speech will go unchallenged. It guarantees that the government will not put you in prison for it. This is a significant and important guarantee. It is also a more limited one than people sometimes assume. And I think the gap between what it does and what people believe it does is responsible for a substantial portion of arguments on the internet, which is where many arguments now live. I find elections interesting. I find them genuinely interesting, in the way I find other slow and complex processes interesting, the way a river changes course over a long time, or the way a piece of music that seems unresolved gradually finds its way to a chord that, in retrospect, feels inevitable. Elections are slow in the large sense. The campaigns are long, the debates are numerous, the coverage is relentless and often unhelpful, and then for a few weeks or months, the country holds a kind of conversation with itself, imperfect, often angry, frequently absurd. And then on a specific day, people go to specific buildings and stand in lines, sometimes long lines, and fill out or feed into a machine a piece of paper, or touch a screen, and indicate a preference. And then those preferences are counted, by humans, by hand and by machine, by people working long hours in county election offices who are often underpaid and almost never recognized, and who have, in my experience of reading about them, a generally sincere commitment to the accuracy of the count. And then a result emerges, and someone wins, and someone loses. And the losing side, in a functioning democracy, accepts the result, not happily, not without protest if there are legitimate concerns about the count, but ultimately accepts that the process has produced an outcome and that the outcome is binding, and that the next step is not to undo the result, but to prepare for the next election. This is the hinge. This is the thing that makes a democracy rather than something else. The acceptance of results. The willingness to say, I did not win this time, and I believe in this process enough to stay in it and try again. Gerald said something like this on election night in a small room above a bait shop. I think about it more than he probably knows. I want to be honest with you about something. I find it hard to talk about American politics right now, in this particular moment, without feeling something that I can only describe as a low-grade concern. Not panic, not despair. Something lower and steadier, a concern the way a flicker in a pilot light is a concern. You keep watching it, you check it, you hope it stays lit. I think this is a reasonable response to the state of things, and I also think that naming it is better than not naming it, because things named can be looked at, and things that can be looked at can sometimes be understood. And understanding is the first step toward not being paralyzed by the thing you're afraid of. I believe in this country's ability to do better. I say that not as a slogan. I have a complicated relationship with slogans, because they tend to end conversations rather than begin them, but as a sincere, considered belief based on watching history move slowly in directions that were not guaranteed. I believe in it because of the people I know personally who work inside the system, quietly, carefully, trying to make it function more fairly. People like Mr. Kowalski, people like Gerald, people like the county clerk I read about once who worked 36 hours straight during a disputed election to make sure every ballot was counted, and whose name I have unfortunately forgotten, which seems unfair, given the hours she worked. I believe in it also because I think the alternative, not believing in it, leads somewhere that I don't want to go, and that most people, regardless of their politics, don't actually want to go either. The alternative to the belief that things can get better is the belief that they can't, and that belief is its own kind of political act, and it tends to produce withdrawal, and withdrawal tends to produce the absence of the people who might have made things better if they'd stayed in it. I think the world needs the Geralds to keep going to council meetings, even the ones they've lost, maybe especially then. Let me tell you about voting, not how to vote. You know how to vote, or you can learn, and I'm not going to be your civics teacher tonight in that specific sense, but about the feeling of voting, which I think doesn't get talked about enough. I vote in a fire station. My polling place is the fire station on Maple Street, which is a very clean and organized building, as fire stations tend to be, and which smells faintly of something industrial and metallic in a way that is not unpleasant. There are folding tables set up in the bay where the trucks are usually parked, and the trucks are moved outside on election days, and you can see them through the open bay door if you look up from your ballot, bright red, enormous, patient in the parking lot, waiting for the voters to finish. I have voted in that fire station since I moved to this town. I know the poll workers by sight now, though I don't know all their names. There is a woman who has been there every election I can remember, who wears reading glasses on a beaded chain and who checks your name in the book, with a practiced efficiency that I find very satisfying. She finds your name, she draws a line through it, she hands you your ballot, all in one smooth motion, the way a musician handles an instrument they've played for decades. I always want to thank her for something more specific than just doing her job, but I'm not sure how to say that without sounding strange, so I say thank you and take my ballot and go to the privacy booth. The privacy booth is a three-sided cardboard construction that folds flat for storage. It is not elegant. It is not particularly private. You can hear the person next to you and sometimes they sigh. But inside it, with my ballot and a black pen, I have the feeling every time of doing something that matters. Not enormously, not world historically, not in any way that will be remembered. My individual vote is one among millions, and its mathematical significance is vanishingly small, and I know this. But the feeling is not mathematical. It is something older, something about being counted, about adding your preference to the collective one, about showing up to a fire station on a Tuesday and saying, I am here, and this is what I think, and I'm part of this. I fill in the bubbles carefully. I bring the ballot to the machine. The machine accepts it with a sound like a deep breath and a small green light. And I get a sticker. The sticker says I voted, in red and blue and white, and I put it on my coat, and I walk out past the fire trucks, and I feel something that is modest and genuine and that I think more people should be encouraged to feel. Not pride exactly. Something quieter. Participation. The having shown upness of it. The world is complicated, and the choices on the ballot are never exactly what I would choose if I were designing the ballot myself, and the system has many problems and produces many outcomes I disagree with, and I voted anyway. I will vote again. This is not a heroic act. It is a small, regular one. Small and regular is what democracy is made of, mostly. The extraordinary moments are the exceptions. The fire station on Tuesday mornings is the rule. I want to spend a few minutes on something called the news, since it is the medium through which most of us experience American politics, and since I think the relationship between politics and news is one of the more complicated and important ones in the current moment. The news, at its best, is how citizens of a democracy know what their government is doing. It is the mechanism of accountability. A free press, protected by the First Amendment, is supposed to watch the powerful and tell the rest of us what it sees. This function is important. It has always been important. Benjamin Franklin was a printer. The pamphleteers of the Revolutionary period were, in a meaningful sense, journalists. The relationship between journalism and democracy is not incidental, it is structural. The news as it exists now is a complicated thing. There are more outlets than there have ever been, which might mean more information, and which does mean more information, but also more noise, and more information of varying quality. And the tools that used to help us tell reliable information from unreliable information, institutional reputation, editorial oversight, a shared sense of what the facts were, are under significant strain. Not gone, but strained. I read the news every morning. I read multiple sources. I try to read sources that I agree with and sources that I disagree with, because I think reading only the sources that agree with you is a little like looking in a mirror to understand the world. You see a version of reality that is always facing you, which is comforting but not comprehensive. I will say this about the news, and then I'll move on. The news is better at covering events than at covering conditions. It is better at telling you what happened than at telling you what is slowly, steadily true. A bill passed today is news. The fact that road maintenance funding has declined steadily for 20 years is a condition, and conditions are harder to cover because they don't have a beginning and an end, a headline, a dateline. Gerald's community center closing was an event. The decades of disinvestment in community infrastructure that made it inevitable was a condition. Both matter. The event is easier to report. I try to pay attention to the conditions. A small and possibly frivolous observation. The language of politics is full of words that have drifted from their original meanings. Liberal, in its classical sense, refers to freedom, liberty, and was associated with free markets and individual rights as much as with social reform. Conservative suggests caution and preservation, but the things being preserved are different in different eras, which means conservatism is always relative to the moment. Radical simply means from the root. A radical change is one that goes to the root of a thing, not necessarily one that is extreme. Moderate suggests the middle of something, but the middle moves. I find it useful, when a political word is used, to ask, what does this person mean by this word? Sometimes the word is a real description of something. Sometimes it is a sound, a noise that signals tribal membership rather than conveying specific meaning. The difference matters. It's worth slowing down enough to ask which one you're hearing. I want to talk briefly about local politics, because I think local politics is where most of what actually affects daily life gets decided, and I think it receives, relative to national politics, a small fraction of the attention it deserves. The city council, the school board, the county commission, the water authority, the zoning board. These are the bodies that decide whether the road gets repaved, whether the community centre stays open, whether the new development gets approved, whether the school has adequate funding, whether the water is safe. These decisions are made by people you can often speak to directly, people whose phone numbers are in some cases publicly listed, people who attend the same events you attend, who buy groceries at the same store you buy groceries at, who live close enough that their decisions are about things you can see and touch and walk on. And yet local elections routinely have the lowest turnout. City council races where the margin is a few hundred votes. School board elections decided by the people who showed up, which is a small fraction of the people who could have. I don't say this to shame anyone. I understand why national politics feels more urgent. The scale is larger, the coverage is more available, the stakes as described are more dramatic. But I think there is a case to be made that the school board is where your children actually go, and the city council is where your street actually is. And the zoning board is deciding right now whether the thing being built next door will be the kind of thing you want next door. And Gerald, who lost his race by 26 percentage points in a district where fewer than 1 in 5 eligible voters participated, Gerald understood this. He just couldn't get the other 4/5 to show up. I voted in the last school board election. There were 3 candidates and 2 seats. I had researched all 3 of them, which took about 40 minutes and involved reading the local paper's voter guide and watching a 20-minute candidate forum that had been recorded and posted online, and that about 300 people had watched, which for a school board election in a town of this size is actually relatively good. I made my choices. I was one of roughly 1,100 voters who participated. The winners were decided by a few hundred votes, 1,100 people. In a town of about 30,000, These are the numbers. These are the dimensions of the room. It is getting late. The tea is cold. The flag outside, if I were to look, is probably still moving a little in the dark. I want to say a few more things before I let you sleep. I think about the people who came before us in this country, not with reverence exactly, because many of them did things that do not deserve reverence, and I am not interested in a patriotism that requires me to ignore those things, but with a kind of attention to the fact that the system we live in now is the result of choices made by people over a very long time, and that those choices were not inevitable, and that the choices we make now will also not disappear but will be the conditions in which the people who come after us have to make their choices. This seems to me like an important thing to hold. We are in the middle of a story, not the beginning, not the end. The middle, which is the hardest part to understand from inside it, but also the part where things can still go in multiple directions. I believe, with some effort and some uncertainty, that the people in this country, most of them, across differences that are real and significant, want roughly similar things. Safety. Enough. Fairness. A good life for their children. Recognition. To be treated with dignity. The disagreements are real, and I don't want to minimize them, and some of them are not resolvable, and the distribution of who gets what has never been equal, and that must be addressed and not papered over. But I think the want, underneath the disagreement, is often the same want, expressed in different language, pointing in different directions, shaped by very different experiences of what this country has actually been to different people. I don't know how to resolve all of that. I don't think anyone does. I think the resolution, to whatever extent it comes, will be slow and partial, and will require people to show up to fire stations and school board meetings and city councils and conversations with their neighbors that are difficult and uncomfortable. I think it will require a lot of Geralds going back to their hardware stores the morning after they lose, knowing where everything is, ready to help the next person who comes in needing something. I think this is a thing worth doing. I think showing up is a thing worth doing, even when, especially when, the outcome is not guaranteed. The guarantee was never the point. The showing up was always the point. I want to end with something that happened at a town hall meeting I attended 2 years ago. It was about a proposed change to the local zoning ordinance, a technical thing not particularly dramatic, having to do with setback requirements for accessory structures, which are things like sheds and garages. I know this does not sound like the stuff of great civic drama. It wasn't. But I went. Because I try to go to these things, because I believe Mr. Kowalski was right that the tool is only useful to the person who picks it up. The meeting was in the public library's meeting room, which holds about 60 people and had perhaps 40 in it that evening. People of different ages, different backgrounds, different levels of preparation. Some had printed documents, some had questions written on their phones, some had clearly arrived without knowing precisely what the agenda was. There was a woman who stood up and asked a question about the setback requirements that revealed she had misunderstood what they would actually affect, and a council member patiently clarified, and she said, "Oh," and sat down, and seemed genuinely grateful for the clarification rather than embarrassed by the misunderstanding, which I thought was admirable. There was a man who had a very strong opinion about drainage, and spoke for perhaps 3 minutes longer than was quite necessary, and people in the rows near him exchanged small glances, but everyone let him finish. There was a teenager, maybe 15, who was there with her mother and who asked a question about environmental impact that was more sophisticated than several of the adult questions, and the council member who answered her did so with complete seriousness, without adjusting his tone for her age, which I thought was exactly right. And then the meeting ended, and people picked up their coats, and they went out into the parking lot, and some of them talked to each other, and some of them got in their cars and drove away into the same darkness we're all driving into, and the library meeting room was put back the way it was found, and the world continued, slightly informed by having heard each other. That is American politics, the meeting in the library, the question about drainage, the teenager who knows about environmental impact, the clarification accepted gracefully, the room put back the way it was found, all of it together. The enormous arguments happening somewhere in the distance, and also this, right here, small and local and real. I find it easier to believe in the country when I think about the library meeting room than when I think about most other things. I suspect you might too. I'd suggest, if you're feeling concerned, and it's okay to feel concerned, concern is not the same as despair, finding your own library meeting room. Your own fire station on a Tuesday, your own Gerald, or being someone else's Gerald. Small rooms, small choices. The tool on the shelf. Waiting for someone to pick it up. I have been talking for a long time, and I notice that the night has gotten quieter in the way nights do when you've been inside them long enough that the quiet no longer seems like an absence but like a presence, like the world has settled into itself, like a long exhale. The chamomile is cold. The flag is still. The fire trucks are back in the station, ready. Someone is working the night shift somewhere in a county election office, updating a spreadsheet, making sure the numbers are right. A teacher is preparing for tomorrow's civics class. The system hums on, at its low civil frequency, and most of what holds it together is invisible, the accumulated weight of people deciding again and again to show up. I believe they will keep deciding this. I hold that belief carefully, like something that needs to be carried without being gripped too tightly. It is not certainty. I don't have certainty. But I have the library meeting room. I have Gerald. I have the woman with the reading glasses on the beaded chain, drawing a line through my name. I have Mr. Kowalski in his blue tie, eating his sandwich, telling us that these tools are only useful to the person who picks them up. I hope you pick them up. I hope you bring them to the meeting. I hope you stand in the fire station on a Tuesday and feel for a moment the modest, genuine weight of participation. It is not nothing. In fact, I think it is quite a lot. Good night. Sleep well. The flag is still there in the morning. So usually is everything else. Thank you for being here with me.